everybody, and welcome to Indie Film Cafe Short Review Thursday. This is where we take a movie and we do a short review, and hopefully we can get to some of the backlog of movies that I've got. And this particular time, I'm looking at a 2013 film called Big Bad Wolves. Now, originally I bought this for $1 at the dollar store. I don't know much about it, but you got to figure with a title like Big Bad Wolves, got to be a werewolf movie, right? Sure. It turns out not so much. So when I ended up getting the movie back at the house and I ended up doing a haul video like I just here in Mook House Studios, you can see my brain buddy up there. I did a little quick research and it turns out this is not a werewolf movie at all, but it is an Israeli movie. Which, you know, that would have been cool if it had been an Israeli werewolf movie because I had never seen anything like that before. But no, it's not a werewolf film, but it is a movie from a couple of gentlemen from Israel by the name of, and I'm going to try and get these names as well as I can, but Aharon Kashales and Navad Papushado. And they are responsible for the 2010 film called Rabies, which is considered Israel's first horror film. So that sounded pretty cool. And then on top of all that, it turns out that Quentin Tarantino himself gave these guys big thumbs up and said, hey, check this movie out. It's really good. So, you know, when the Q man is giving you some bona fides, that's going to get you some notice. So I saw that and said, okay, let's definitely check this film out. And so I put it on there. And so, yep, as comes to find out, it's not a werewolf film. Instead, this is more of a sort of a horror comedy cop drama. And it's about this guy who's supposed to be a suspect in a series of child murders. And the cops sort of pick him up and drag him off to someplace and beat the shit out of him. But they're unable to get any kind of confession, and I guess they don't have any evidence. They don't really mention that. Maybe things are a little different in Israel, I don't know. But basically, they are forced to let him go, and then some little kid was there with his iPhone and is there recording everything. So that video comes out, the shit hits the fan, and the main cop guy by the name of Mickey ends up getting put on leave, which is not the sort of thing he wants to have happen. His boss is there and his boss has his like kid there, and the kid is sort of mirroring everything that the boss tells him, like, you're gonna pay for this and blah, 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 and you're gonna have to be relieved of duty. But if you're gonna go off and do anything on your own, just don't get caught. And that's kind of where some of the comedy is supposed to be coming from, is with like the little kids, mirroring his dad. Some of it works, some of it doesn't. Mostly it doesn't, but I'll get into that. But anyway, so the cop is now free. The cop is named Mickey, like I said, and the suspect is a Bible teacher by the name of Dror. And so he ends up following Dror and sort of camps outside his house in his car and just follows him. So Dror goes out with his dog all the time, and he ends up stalking him, and he brings his taser with him, and he goes to get the guy. But of course, first he's got to tase the dog. So he like zaps the dog over and over and over until it goes unconscious. Again, that's supposed to be some of the comedy there, which, that's one of the cardinal rules. You don't hurt the animal, you don't hurt the dog, but that's been, one of the tropes that they're upending here. You might find that funny, you might not. But eventually he ends up zapping that guy and throws him in the trunk of his car. But what he doesn't know is that there is a third person who is the father of the girl who's just been killed. And by the way, they find her body. You don't see the whole thing. You only see it, say, from the waist down, but she's supposed to be a little girl, a kid, and her body is blood spattered and her panties are down around her ankles. So again, not really ha-ha-haing up with the comedy there. So in any event, the vigilante cop has the suspect in the trunk of his car, drives him out in the middle of nowhere, which was pretty interesting in and of itself, because this nowhere they go to is very woodsy and green and full of trees. And that's not what I expected in Israel. I've just kind of always assumed it was a desert and there'd be no trees. But, there you go. Shows you what I know. And anyway, he takes him out of the car, gives him a shovel, marches him out there and says, forces him to dig a hole. Basically, he's threatening to kill him. And the guy's like, oh, what are you going to do? You're going to shoot me? You don't know I did anything. You have no proof. You'll never live with yourself if you end up being wrong, blah, 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 blah. And before the guy can actually do anything, the other guy who's been trailing the two of them comes up and clunks the cop on the head, knocks him out. And the suspect thinks this guy is there to help him. And he's like, oh, well, thank you very much. And the other guy's like, oh, yeah, sure. Clunk, knocks his ass out too, throws him in the trunk as well. And they both drive back to a house that earlier there was a scene where we saw him buying the quote unquote hellhole from a real estate agent. They keep referring to it as a hellhole. It's actually a very nice house in the middle of a very nice wooded, peaceful area. I don't know why they keep calling it hellhole. I guess because they keep mentioning the fact that there are Arab neighbors. I don't know. But that's another thing. They, none of the troubles between Arabs and Israelites are really mentioned in this film, other than there's one point where one of the Arab neighbors talks to him and says, hey, I don't know why you people are always assuming we're out to kill you folks. We're just normal people. And the father's like, yeah, I know. So there's a little bit of humor in there. But in any event, he's got both the cop and the suspect in the basement. He manages to convince the cop to help him, as long as the cop joins in with the torture, because now we're going into a sort of torture porn film. And the cop at first starts to help, and then he decides this is probably not a good idea, because again, if this guy's not going to confess and there's no evidence, how are you going to know whether he really did it? The father is 100% convinced, and even though there's no evidence, he's just going full-blown nuts on the guy. And the cop is not quite there yet, so he manages to try to sort of make an arrangement with the suspect, but the father comes and finds out and clonks him on the head and ends up tying him to a post or using cuffs him there. And then there's some other stuff, because apparently the father's marriage is going down the tube, so his parents keep bugging him, they keep calling, and eventually the father shows up with a big bunch of soup, because the father the father of the daughter who's been killed has been trying to lie and say that he's been sick. So his father, who I guess you can call the grandfather, I don't remember his name, he shows up, and so the father's got to keep the grandfather away from the basement so he doesn't find out about what's going on. But of course that ends up happening, and there's a subplot going on about how they were going to the father was going to originally feed the suspect a cake made with sleeping pills, because apparently that's what this guy did to his victims. He would drug them, then take them back, and then torment them and rape them and chop them into little bits and do all wonderful things like that. So he was going to do that. He ends up not doing that, but the cake is there, and then the grandfather ends up eating a piece of it, and he's out. And some of the humor is in there. But that allows an opportunity for the cop to escape, and he runs off. And in between time, the father's been torturing the suspect. He's been like breaking his hands and fingers with hammers, and he get a blowtorch, because that's the other thing about the grandfather is he does end up finding out about it, and he decides he's going to help. So he I guess was in the Israeli army, so he tells him about the fire test, which is basically to get a little blowtorch and start lighting his ass on fire. Fun. And so he ends up doing that. And fortunately, the cop is able to escape, and he runs out. But before the cop can actually get anywhere, he finds out he gets a cell phone from one of the Arab guys on the horse, and it turns out his own daughter is missing. So now he's got to run all the way back, because I guess he assumes that it's the same suspect who does that. But unfortunately, by the time he gets there, the father is pretty much sawing the head off of this guy, and that guy dies. And he ends up not getting any information about it. And the last scene of the movie is they're in the guys in the suspect's basement. They're looking around, they can't find anything, and then the camera pans left, and lo and behold, there is the policeman's daughter on another wall, knocked out. So presumably she'll never get found and will die too. Funny. Yeah. So my main issue with this particular film is that it's supposed to be a horror comedy, but it's not really particularly horrible, and it's not particularly funny either. Um, so let me kind of mention some of the folks who are involved in it. The cop, whose name is Mickey, is played by Lior Ashkenazi. The teacher, who's the suspect, whose also name is Dror, is played by Rotem Kainan. The father, I guess of the daughter, is named I think his name is Gidri, or something like that, and he's played by Sahi Grad. I'm sorry, I'm trying to do the best I can with the names. And then the grandfather is I think I can't remember his name, but I know he's played by Dorle Glickman. And he's like the veteran actor of the whole bunch. He has been in a lot of Israeli television, and if you look on his Internet Movie Database profile, he goes all the way back to 1977 as far as his movie involvement. And the acting overall is decent. I question some of the choices that some of the actors made. In particular, the guy who plays Dror. I would have expected somebody who insists that he's innocent and is about to be tortured, and it is tortured, that he would make a whole lot more of a vociferous fuss about not being the guy. He says it, but he's not really saying it like you would, like if you were in fear for your life. And then there are a number of occasions too where he's actually getting physically tormented and physically tortured, especially with the blowtorch. And while he does cry out immediately, like 5-10 seconds later, he's just talking normally like it never happened. I'm like, man, there would be all kinds of physical and psychological trauma that should be informing your performance. So this guy, I guess, decided to play him a lot more understated than I would have thought would have been realistic, in my opinion. And then there's some story issues too. I wasn't really, as far as being a horror comedy, that's a very, very difficult road to hoe, in my opinion, especially if you're got to do two things. If you got to do comedy, which is hard as it is, and if you're going to be doing horror, especially because, this wants to sort of vaguely get into the area of torture porn. There's some torture there, but it's nothing like you've seen in other movies. It's not Hostel, and it's not some of the other, it's not a Serbian film or anything like that. It kind of hints at it without really going into it. So the comedy aspects that don't really work kind of undermine the horror. And at the same time, the horror aspects or the torture aspects really undermine the comedy parts. Like I didn't find the body of the dead girl with her panties by her ankles to be particularly funny. That's just not a rich vein of humor, in my opinion. The zapping of the dog with the taser might be funny to some. I didn't particularly find it funny. So it kind of fell flat on both of those, and it's kind of a shame because everything else in the film is very well decent as far as production values. It's directed very well. The sound, the lighting, all the props, all the settings, all the costumes, everything looks really, really good. It's very top notch. It's very, very clear. Everything looks good. Everything sounds good. And for the most part, I'd say the acting, other than one or two choices, is still pretty darn good. Everyone's very, very believable, at least as far as sort of, as far as this film goes. I mean, there were a couple of choices I didn't agree with, but for the most part, the acting was decent. It's just the story itself could have used tightening, could have used some cleaning up. And, the thing is that these guys supposedly made a really good film in Rabies, so I'd like to go and check it out. It's just for this particular film, it just wasn't as good as I was hoping it could be. I think overall, I'm still going to mildly suggest go ahead and get it, especially if you're like me and you find this for $1 at the dollar store at Dollar Tree. I mean, come on, you can't beat that with a stick. For $1, this movie's definitely worth it. So if you can get this movie fairly cheap, I would say go ahead and get it. Maybe keep an eye out for some of their other films, because clearly these guys have a pretty good idea of what they're doing, and there should be some good stuff coming out from them in the future. And certainly the 2010 movie Rabies is one I want to check out, because that's also been given a lot of good press. So this particular film, I don't know that I would want to spend, say, $15 on it, or maybe, more on a Blu-ray. I don't know that it's necessarily worth that, but if you can get it cheap, I'd say probably go for it. I'd say you're probably going to be okay with it, and keep an eye out for these guys. I think they'll probably have a pretty decent future. Maybe just work a little bit more on the screenplay and tighten things up. And it's just like there was one point where, I think I mentioned where the cop, he discovers that his daughter is missing and goes back. But the thing is that we already saw that he had been with the suspect all the way back when he had been talking to his daughter on the phone. So he couldn't have been really the one. So when he was going back, I figured he was going to go back and say, hey, this guy couldn't have done it because I'd been with him all this time. But no, he just goes back there and says, hey, where is the girl? And I guess the movie implies that he did take her, because you do see her in the last frame of the shot. But when did he have the chance to do that? I don't know. There's some stuff that just didn't quite make some sense to me. So yeah, if you go back and clean up some of the screenplay a little bit, I think you'd have a first-rate film. Maybe not quite as top notch as, say, Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels, which I think is what this film wants to be. But certainly it could be an entertaining film, and certainly for a buck, I think you can't go wrong. So overall, this isn't a bad film. I'm going to mildly go ahead and say check it out. So there you go, folks. The Big Bad Wolf. So please join us again for an utter review for Indie Film Cafe here on Short Review Thursdays, and we will see you on the flip side. Bye.